Concern and anxiety. As brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ, we should expect periods of anxiety that relate to the impact of sin on our relationships. Here's Gene to explain this principle.
2 Corinthians 2:12-13, Paul addresses that. When I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, now this is after Paul left Ephesus, and he went to Troas. Remember Troas? That's where he had the Macedonian call. Don't know whether he traveled by land or by sea, but he followed the Aegean Sea, and he got up there to Troas, which is across from Philippi and Thessalonica. And so he goes back to that area, and evidently there were some believers there. But he had a purpose. When I came to Troas for the gospel of Christ, a door was opened to me by the Lord. Once I left Ephesus, but when I got there, now notice, I had no rest in my spirit. I was deeply troubled. I believe I was in the will of God, but I had no rest in my spirit. Why? Because I did not find my brother Titus. Why did that give him no rest in his spirit? Because Titus was the one that delivered the lost letter. And remember, he didn't have internet. He didn't have telephones. He couldn't get word. What happened? How did these Corinthians respond to my letter? That painful letter. And he's worried sick. I had no rest in my spirit because I did not find my brother Titus. But I said goodbye to them, and I left for Macedonia. I crossed over the Aegean Sea. I went over to Macedonia, into the area of Philippi and Thessalonica and Berea and those areas. Now, at this point, we see that Paul had two purposes in writing that painful letter. Let me review the first one. The first purpose of that lost letter. I made up my mind about this, not to come to you on another painful visit, for I caused you pain. If I cause you pain, then who will cheer me other than the one hurt? The first purpose, he did not want to create more pain. For them or for himself. He didn't feel the timing was right, even though he said he was going to do it. And he felt God led him to change his mind. Another purpose is if you go down into verse 9. It was for this purpose I wrote, so I may know your proven character if you are obedient in everything. In other words, I really didn't want to cause pain. I put it in writing, but my purpose in writing this was to give you something to think about and to reflect on and to see if you really, really had the character to listen and obey what God's will was. Those were the two reasons that he wrote. And so he's got all of this anxiety about how they would respond to that. Number one, did it create more pain? Number two, did it prove their character? Now, later on in the letter, we know that he did meet Titus. And I'm going to jump you ahead here to chapter 7, and we'll look at that in a future presentation, but he says, in fact, when we came into Macedonia, we had no rest. Instead, we were afflicted in every way, lots of more trouble, struggles on the outside, fears inside. You know, he's going through some tough stuff in Macedonia. But God, who comforts the humble, comforted us by the coming of Titus. And not only by his coming, but also by the comfort he received from you. In other words, he was frightened too when he came with that letter. And they received it, at least the majority. He announced to us your deep longing, your sorrow, your zeal for me. That meant a lot to Paul. He was human. He didn't want it to be rejected even more. So that I rejoiced even more. For although I grieved you with my letter, see, he's going back to that letter. I grieved you with my letter. I do not regret it now, even though I did regret it, since I saw that the letter grieved you, though only for a little while. We see the end of that story. Now, when you get to going back to chapter 2, verse 17, the passage we're looking at, there's another concern now that emerges. It's not just the pain or not knowing what happened with that letter. He says, we are not like the many, and highlight the many, who make a trade in God's message for profit. but as those with sincerity we speak in Christ as from God and before God. Now, he's going to be subtly addressing these false apostles. And he doesn't come right out and say, we're not like those people who are leading you astray. What he says is, we are not like the many who make a trade in God's message for profit. He's generalizing because the New Testament world was filled with false apostles. Their only motive was money. Their only motive was personal gain. And he says, we're not like that. Now, he's going to zero in, as we'll see in a moment, on who he's talking about. In fact, if you go to chapter 11, jumping ahead, he gets very specific. See, this is why, if you're going to understand the opening part of 2 Corinthians, you have to understand the latter part of it, because he gets to what's bothering him. And here he says in chapter 11, I will continue to do what I'm doing in order to cut off the opportunity of those who want an opportunity to be regarded just as we are in what they're boasting about. For such people are false apostles, deceitful workers, disguising themselves as apostles of Christ. And no wonder, for Satan himself is disguised as an angel of light. Now, Paul is getting very bold and very specific in addressing another issue that was troubling him deeply in terms of the response that he was getting from Corinth. There were a group of false apostles who came into that church probably after they received that lost letter and just said, this guy is ambivalent, he's vacillating, he's insincere, he's probably even immoral, he has false aims, false goals, don't follow that man. By the way, isn't it interesting? They were accusing Paul of their own sins. Projection, by the way, is another thing that happens with evil people. In order to camouflage their sin, they will accuse you of some of the very same things that they're guilty of. And that's another reason Paul was feeling such pain when he penned this letter. He doesn't deal with it right up front, but he subtly moves into it, and here he gets very, very specific. The question that's fascinating to me, in view of Paul's concern and anxiety in Troas, we read about it. My spirit was deeply troubled. And even when he went into Macedonia, he worried about this. He was concerned about their response. How do you suppose he would explain what he later wrote to the Philippians? Let me just share with you what he wrote to the Philippians. Don't worry about anything. Oh, right, Paul? Don't worry about anything, but in everything, through prayer and petition with thanksgiving, let your requests be made known to God. And the peace of God, which surpasses every thought, will guard your hearts and your minds in Christ Jesus. If Paul were here tonight and you asked him that question, and he wrote that from prison, this happened obviously after his experience there in Macedonia, where he said, my spirit was heavy, I had trouble in spirit. In essence, I couldn't sleep nights. I was worried about the response. I didn't know whether they were responding in acceptance. I don't know what they even did to Titus. Maybe they took Titus on like they took me on. I wonder if Titus can handle that. And he's worried about this, and he's concerned about this, and it's bothering him deeply. What would he say if he were here? I think he might say, you misunderstand me. I didn't say that if you're worried, that if you stop worrying and praying, the problem's going to be resolved tomorrow or the next day or the next week. It's going to take time. And that took time for me to experience the answers to my prayers. And they didn't really come until I met Titus. After I left Macedonia, across the Aegean Sea, was over there in Macedonia, he finally came. My prayers are answered. I think sometimes we give people a false assurance when we say, number one, we give them false guilt when we say you shouldn't be worrying. Paul worried. But what Paul would say is, pray, seek God, seek help. There's an answer here. You will find peace. You will find God coming to you. Now, it may happen overnight. I've experienced when I've prayed, when I've had anxiety and I can't sleep, and I pray about it, or Elaine and I pray about it, and suddenly I have a sense of peace. I go back to sleep, but I'll tell you, first thing in the morning I wake up, I'm thinking about it. The problem's not gone away. The problem isn't solved. I may have more strength to handle it. Depends on the situation. If it's a Corinthian situation, it's not going to go away overnight. And I want to tell you, when I went through that experience of a conspiracy against me, that went on for months before I had a sense of real peace about it. And I never had a total sense of peace about it until I found out the truth about the conspirators and their evil intentions. And then I had a sense of peace. Oh, now I know the truth, and the truth sets you free. Now maybe that'll be encouragement to you. It's not an excuse for not trusting God, but what it is a reality that Paul himself experienced anxiety. He ultimately solved it through prayer and God coming to him through Titus, but it took time.